they look like these three equations here, which is fairly similar to what you have for a fixed wing. Here, we, of course, you have the bank angle, so the tilt of the UAV that influences how it changes its course. But in general, it's fairly similar. The other difference is that the mobile robot can stand still, right? Fixed wing cannot do this, but you can just set a requirement that the mobile robot should always be moving forwards with a certain velocity, and then we get this non-holonomic constraints. So the kinematics ends up being this very similar. So that's kind of the motivation for using these mobile robots for this evaluation project. The simulation looks like this. We have the inner mobile robot, and we have the guidance algorithm in kind of in the outer loop, and then we have the desired path that we're trying to follow. And inside of the mobile robot, the way that I decided to do it for this project was the guidance law generates desired angular velocities for the wheels, and then we have a closed loop here with a PI controller that then controls the angular velocity of the wheels, such that the angular velocity of the wheels goes towards the desired, and therefore we also end up achieving the desired velocity, angular velocity from the guidance algorithm. And then we just have the kinematics here that updates the motion of the wheel. And if you look at the results in this simulation, we had a path, a straight line that we wanted to follow. And here is then the path of the mobile robot, and you can see that it ends up following this path. We're using PI controllers. The reason for that is that then we can ensure that it converges to its desired velocity that we set from the guidance algorithm. And that's just at the moment set to a constant 0.5 meters per second. If we just had P controllers here, you would still be able to achieve your path following objective, but you would have a steady state error here in the velocity. So when it comes to the visualization, sometimes for students, usually out from Simlink, when you do your simulation, you'll end up with some graphs that you need to look at. And sometimes, if students are not necessarily that experienced with doing these types of simulations, it can be, especially if the simulation starts getting complex, it can be difficult to get an idea of if the system is behaving in a proper way. And visualization is a way to help with doing this, to get the students the ability to view their simulation, for instance, in real time, and see if the system is actually performing in a way that seems reasonable. So what we have in this simulation here is that I can run this simulation in Simlink, and it will update in real time during the simulation in Blender here, for instance. And if you stop the simulation and if you stop this running, you can then play back the animation, and you can then evaluate the properties or the behavior of the system, see if it's reasonable. And the way of doing this is fairly simple. It's actually just you're sending UDP packets to Blender, and it's just receiving and updating the position orientation of your UAV. We also have this one that makes sure that this simulation runs in kind of like real time. So usually simulations run a lot faster than what this one is set to do. So that's one way you can do visualizations. There are built-in tools nowadays in Simlink that can do similar things, but this offers a lot of flexibility, and it's fairly easy to set up for students at least. And when you're done, you can render out, for instance, nice visualizations that you can then add into your projects, and you can show them off, for instance. When it comes to the implementation, what we're using here is the TI RSLK hardware. So it's just a mobile robot that has a chassis, it has some plastic gear motors, it has some Hall effect encoders that we use for the odometry to measure the motion of the mobile robot, and we have a TI MSP 432P4010 launchpad on it, which has a 48 megahertz RM Cortex M4F, which has a floating point unit, so you can do some calculations on it. And this module here comes with a free, there is a free online course available by John Valovano from the University of Texas that can be used in educational setting. So I use this for those reasons in this project. And the software, I didn't end up, so also with this free online course, they have a lot of template code and so on that you can use to set up your projects. I didn't end up using any of that or the course itself in this project. It was just much easier to write everything from scratch. So implementation is just event-based implementation. And we have just some setup function, and then we have an infinite loop that checks a flag. And this flag is set about 100 times per second through a timer. And when this flag is set, we clear the flag and we update the mobile robot. And we update it by calculating the angular velocities from the encoders. We update the odometries, we update the position orientation based on these measurements of the mobile robot. Then we run the guidance algorithm and we feed that into the PID algorithm or the PI controllers. And then we just return. So the final code size is about 370 lines. Everything is divided into header files and source files. So we switch out the controllers, we can easily switch out the guidance logic. And also the source code is MISRA C 2004 compliant, just means that it follows guidelines for safety critical systems. I put a star there because for the Texas Instruments, they have a bunch of header files that you can use with this Cortex processor that makes it easier to program in. But those header files and that included code does not follow these type of guidelines. So the project itself with that header files is not MISRA C compliant, but the code that I wrote for the project is. So when we put this all together, we run it as an experiment, we end up with something like this. So it's running more or less the same setup as the simulation, and it's just following a straight line about 45 degrees. So we have done, so everything ended up working really nicely together. It was fairly straightforward to set everything up in program, but there's still a lot to do. So we used the TI RSLK as a platform for evaluating path following algorithms for fixed wing UAVs. And the implementation is all right, but there's some issues or some things that should be fixed. For instance, the geometry is based on dead reckoning, which is it's going to be wheel slip is an issue, so it's going to drift over time. And yeah, so we used there's an online course for this, but the hardware platform is essentially, I would say, it's expensive. So there are other mobile robot platforms that are cheaper and could be used instead. And there's a lot of future work that can be done for this. For instance, setting up an absolute positioning system with a camera is probably one that's more interesting to get rid of the drift issue with the wheel slips. So yeah, I think that's it for the presentation. So yeah, if there's any questions. What's the validation of fixed wing simulations? Do you mean the guidance laws that were implemented, if they were also validated using fixed wing simulations? Then the answer to that is yes. Those are also been tested with fixed wings, those implementations. So when it comes to curved reference paths, we have previously done some work with Hermite splines and B splines. So that's an option to use. And one very common method to use is Dubin's paths, where you use some local curves, you use straight lines and circles, and you connect them together to interpolate waypoints. That's a very common method to use. But yeah, it would be interesting to extend this using some splines, for instance, like B splines. So in slide 3, the difference mentioned between path planning and guidance system. Okay. So I can go in here. So this one. So path following is kind of contained in, I would say it's kind of contained in guidance. Because guidance can be, for instance, you need to follow a certain path, you need to avoid collisions with other obstacles. And it can contain a lot of things that the UAV should simultaneously do to achieve its objective. The path following itself is just one particular part of the whole guidance system itself, which is usually to follow some kind of path. Often missions that you would give to a UAV would be to visit some geographic locations of interest, and then the UAV has to then construct a path through path planning or mission planning, and then it has to, through the guidance algorithms, follow this path. And often this path is also generated in a way that is free of collisions. So it's also very important that you ensure that the UAV is able to follow this path precisely, as least precisely as possible. So yeah, path following is a kind of like a subtask of guidance. Guidance is a bit more general. Yeah, when it comes to the L1, this one is often set as a constant. If it's smaller, it means that you will more aggressively go towards the path. If it's larger, you will have a more smooth transition over to the path. Usually it's set as a constant, at least from what I've seen, but there's probably possibilities of having this vary, depending on if you are, depending on what kind of paths you're following and how aggressive these kind of paths are. So there's probably ways to make this more adaptive. You also have an issue where if you are further away from the path than this radius here, then there's no intersection. But then you can just pretend that you intersected the line in one point so that this is tangent and you are actually going straight towards the path instead, until there is intersections, and then you can then retrieve this point. And that can be handled easily by a line circle intersection. So yeah.
I guess we're pretty close to that, the 5 minutes for your Q&A session. So, well, we have more time, but if there aren't any more questions, then I guess we can move on. I guess the answer is that there's no more questions.
Yeah, if there's any other questions to the project that you think of later, you can also just ask me in the Discord, of course.
Yeah, well, I guess we'll move on. The next person is Raggy. He couldn't be here due to time zones, but I have a pre-recorded video from him. And because he's not here, of course, the questions will have to be asked over Discord. Just ping him for the questions, and yeah, hopefully this works.
Hey everyone, I'm Raghav Mishra. I'm sorry I can't be there in live because I'm in an Australian time zone and apparently we're second class citizens of the world. But hello to everyone. Those who don't know me, I'm a master's student in mechatronics at the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia. And I'm here to talk to you about the use of central pattern generators in robot locomotion. Let me introduce these super interesting control methods which are at the forefront of both neuroscience and robotics by introducing our problem context. So, often in control, we have these control systems for which the actuation is periodic. Now, this is particularly the case for robots which locomote. So, when legged animals like spot many are walking, or when fish-like robots are swimming, or when ornithocopters are flapping their wings, etc., we get these actuation outputs. And these actuation outputs are periodic and follow this limit cycle behavior, as we call it in traditional control. And the question is, how do we build that knowledge? The fact that we have these limit cycle periodic behaviors and put that into a controller um, in a way that it benefits us. So reducing the problem dimensionality or giving any other um, benefits to that knowledge that our periodic outputs take some specific periodic form. Well, if you look around, we already have a lot of these controllers which do um, these periodic motions, which are animals and humans and mammals specifically have these very interesting neural circuits. So basically, groups of neurons connected in a particular way called central pattern generators. So they're generally found in the spine of mammals, and they do exactly this. So not only do they do the exact same stuff like walking and swimming and flying, but they also do lots of other stuff like breathing and maintaining your heart rate and all of these periodic things, or not just that, but swallowing. So what are these? So how do they work, and can we take advantage of them in robots? Well, over the last couple of decades, we've come to study these biological central pattern generators, or CPGs. We've come to know what they do, how they do it, and also how to replicate their behavior and how to take advantage of it in robots. But now the question is, why would we use these particular CPGs as opposed to traditional control methods, which have these theoretical backings and strong guarantees and all these interesting things to as control theorists? Well, they have a lot of interesting behaviors. So they have they can take in modulating non-periodic inputs. So instead of being given some sort of periodic input, we will give it some sort of static level amount of actuation. So maybe at 0% it does nothing, but if as you increase it, it starts slow walking. As you increase it further and further, it increases frequency and amplitude. So maybe you start off slowly walking, but over time you start jogging and running, and then you get these phase transitions. So for example, going from walking to running is already a interesting enough phase transition. But also you in birth, for example, you get as you get to high levels of actuation in this input, you get birds flapping the wings, or for a salamander, when you increase the actuation, you start getting a salamander doing these wavy swimming motions to swim, um, and for a cat, you go from these small walking gaits to these jumping trotting gaits. So that's some very interesting um, behavior. So well, let's go through the list of these things. So well, and we already talked about this. Take these periodic control outputs, but also they do this distribution of control. So what this means in animals is that in animals you don't actually need the brain controlling this complex walking motion. The spine can do that on its own. That's why if you cut off the head of a chicken, it can keep running around, because these CPGs are actuating these muscles in the right ways to keep them moving. And it's not just that though. The not only does the brain only give an actuation signal, it actually increases the control bandwidth for a chicken, for example, because instead of the signal going all the way back to the head, it only has to travel back to the spine, and it fixes that it sort of increases the feedback. In robots, you can also do something very similar. This distributing the control so that only specific specific CPG neurons actually have to deal with disturbances in their local region that they're actuating. Three, it provides this dimensionality reduction. So this is pretty useful to us roboticists, because we often do machine learning or evolutionary algorithms. So when you're doing reinforcement learning or evolutionary algorithms like genetic algorithms, you can significantly decrease the sort of search space for your algorithms, because instead of learning a whole complex trajectory of this complex walking policy, you can just have a few parameters that act as these driving inputs, and you can just use those to decide the best walking input. So for example, if you have some sort of control method, you can you can come up with parameters such as stride length, or length of footstep, or whatever, and this provides a massive dimensionality reduction, which can be pretty useful. Another reason is that it's the reason why these CPG papers were published not just in classical control and robotic conferences like ICRA and IROS, but also in science and nature robotics, because not only is this an interesting bio-inspired control method, but it also feeds back. It gives back, so you can recreate these control architectures and use that to study animal locomotion and animal neuroscience. And as we talked before, it gives you automatic gate transitions, which is super interesting, because you can it provides us a way to switch between different sort of trajectories very naturally. So you don't even have to you can just maintain the state of your oscillator phase and amplitude, and just as you increase the driving input, the actuator on the neurons on its own switch gates. So that's very similar behavior to what you would see in animals. Now we've talked a lot about these benefits, and if you look, there's TED Talk that actually talk about this exact stuff, but we haven't actually looked at what's interesting for control theorists, which would be actually the models for CPGs and how they connect together and the actual science behind it. So let's look at a couple of CPG models. Well, over the last few decades, we actually have a pretty good idea of how neurons behave. And so if you've taken differential equations classes, or maybe mathematical biology classes, you'll have heard of Hodgkin-Huxley models. And so those models are actually very biologically accurate models of how neurons behave. So these models include different sodium and potassium channels, and basically they act like circuit models with current sources and capacitances, and these are very biologically accurate, and we can actually use these and create oscillator circuits out of them. But as I said before, a lot of the power of the CPG comes not just from the fact that they're neurons, but the coupling that they get as oscillators. So they've actually done studies on this where people try different oscillator models and their different couplings, and if you connect them up the same way, even if they're different oscillator models, they produce approximately the same interesting behaviors. So while on the right you have this complex and very non-linear looking. There's actually more equations that I didn't include here. So, for example, the piecewise g being a piecewise discontinuous function, etc. While you can have these accurate biological models, you don't actually need them. You can, if you study these oscillators properly, you can come up with better oscillator models. So, for example, this is a Karumoto oscillator based on biologically inspired, but obviously very different. So, let's look at this in a bit more detail. This is actually a modified Karumoto oscillator, so I got this from one of the papers. This Let's look at this. So it has a phase, it has some amplitude and some driving input, and the way that the oscillator phase changes is given some first we assign it some input intrinsic frequencies, and this is something you can hand tune or we can explore using evolutionary algorithms, etc. And then we also have a matrix K, and the K matrix basically tells you the coupling between different oscillators. So Kij is just the coupling between the ith oscillator and the jth oscillator, and this sort of phase correcting difference. So take the difference between the phase of j and I, take the sine of it, so this sort of puts it back into angular coordinates, and this is this is what makes it a modified oscillator, because this particular paper had a pacemaker circuit for numerical reasons, and this pacemaker circuit had its own phase. So yeah, basically you have this phase and it's changing with some intrinsic frequency, and this coupling matrix which decides how each particular oscillator couples with other oscillators, and you can basically change how this neural network works by changing this weight matrix. So there's similar stuff going on with the amplitude of this oscillator, and so this is basically a simplified oscillator circuit where you've got amplitude, you've got an amplitude in a phase, and it's all coupled together by with other oscillators and their phase difference. So how do you actually take this CPG model, or either of these CPG models, and how do you actually put it into a real robot? How do you take this dynamical system that we know and that we studied and we know the behavior of, and how do you use it in an actual robot? Well, there's actually quite a few different ways. So I'm gonna give some actual real life examples here. This is one paper from this year actually, using a UAV called Thor. Very interesting UAV. It has these interesting it swings both in a hover mode and in a sort of fixed wing mode. Very interesting. But what's special is that in hover mode, it does this by modulating these two motors. So you have these motors and these airfoils, and it does this hover by just controlling these things. And as this thing is flying, it actually has to keep spinning again and again, and so it's sort of a periodic control problem, and so it makes sense to use a CPG. So a CPG will make it a lot more natural to control this thing. So you can actually sort of just drop in a CPG network directly into your block diagram. So if you have a tip path plane desired sort of you can basically create desired inputs and plug it into this control CPG control input and modulate this and if you modulate this properly, you'll just have this low dimensional control input on X and Y, and your CPG network will produce these complex periodic actuator outputs. And so that's a relatively simple way. What's more interesting is if you look at here, so this is one of the people by the original by expert, this team, BioRob team at EPFL, and so they were studying the neuroscience and coupling behavior for salamanders. So they made a salamander robot with this sort of spine with at each spine sort of link there being a different CPG, and then there being even another CPG for the legs. And when you combine this, they made this salamander robot, which is actually very accurate in recreating the behavior of salamanders. So it behaves almost identically, if I say. Um, and all they did was just use these CPGs, and these CPGs create this periodic position, desired position, and that's just followed by a PD controller, for example. In this case, the CPG output went straight to the actuation. In this case, it's going to a PD, it's acting as a position, and this position is being followed by a PD controller. Now, this is actually something from my group at CSIRO in Brisbane, and so they made these massive hexapods for the DARPA Sub-T Robotics Challenge, and so they made this. So they basically took advantage of the dimensionality reduction aspect. So they used these CPGs along with splines to create this complex tripod gates and different types of hexapod gates, and that creates these sort of trajectories for the leg tip to follow, and they just follow those using inverse kinematics and impedance control. Sort of similar to the last example, but it creates more complex trajectories, not just position outputs, and they're followed by impedance instead of PID. Now, finally, we get into gate transition architectures. So we looked at how CPGs can produce these gate transitions from walking to swimming or flying or trotting, for example. And that behavior actually comes almost entirely from having a combination of oscillators and the right coupling and the intrinsic frequency around it. So if you go back to the salamander robot, if you have these legs, so basically if you choose the saturation limits for the legs and the intrinsic frequency for the legs and spine correctly, you can get this transition yourself quite simply with just this. So if you have these oscillators, you set these ones to high intrinsic frequencies, you set these ones to low intrinsic frequencies with low saturation, you sort of get this behavior naturally. And that's one of the very interesting things about CPGs, these gate transitions that you see in animals and that you can replicate in robots. Now, if you want to read more about this, definitely see the papers by EPFL Biorobotics Lab. So they've done a lot of the most interesting work in combining neuroscience and robotics, and they've been one of the most interesting teams in actually implementing these in real robots. If you want to read about them more from the biology and neuroscience side, there's another review paper you can read here. If you would like to see code, I found this very interesting paper where they actually sort of they also create this CPG architecture along with the artificial neural network to control it, and it sort of makes this artificial hierarchical controller, so which basically looks like a nervous system for a robot laid out like you would for a human. And so there's a GitHub link for it there. And that's all for me. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, just ping me on Discord. Cheers.
So yeah, I was supposed to mention, if you have any questions for him, just send them over Discord. And if they're ready, the next person is...
It's me.
Hello, yes.
Yep. So I'm gonna share screen, so can you see it? Can you hear me?
Yep, everything looks to be working.
Okay, cool. All right, so thanks a lot for coming, and thanks to the organizers for organizing that. So today I'm going to talk about something I've been working on for almost 10 years now. She's going to be 10 years next year. So, and the idea was to try to mix like ideas from control theory and biology to come up with like the control theory, and also like tools and architecture around that for controlling biological systems. All right, so that's pretty much the outline. So I've tried to keep like the complexity low. So that's, I'm trying to limit the jargon. I'm going to limit also like the equations to the strict minimum, so that, I mean, I'm not losing people on the way, because I mean, that's not the point of this talk. So I still need to recall a bit of biology, and also the concept of noise, which is extremely important, and it's also something that is different from the noise in engineering. So that's why, I mean, I need to spend a bit of time on that. I'm going to talk about homeostasis, and it's the connection to integral control. I'm going to talk also very quickly about two possible control strategies, so in silico and in vivo control. And I will have a first theoretical result and some simulations and experiments to illustrate the ideas. So that's pretty much the only slide I will have on biology. So basically what we call the central dogma in biology is how proteins are synthesized from DNA. So what we have is that we start from DNA, so gene, and we have a reaction called transcription that turns the gene into like a messenger RNA, so mRNA, that is going to be in turn translated into a protein. Proteins are just basically machines that are going to achieve some functions inside the organism. So for instance, I mean, taking the example of the insulin that is responsible for regulating glucose in the bloodstream. So we can, for instance,
do you have your mic on an automatic gain setting or something? You seem to be phasing out a little bit once in a while.
It's pretty much the same. Maybe I should talk louder. I don't know.
That would help, I guess.
Okay, so
it may be just an automatic thing. So
because I mean, I've never had this problem before. I mean, can you hear me now? I mean, there is like, is it cutting?
It's generally fine. It's just when you're kind of low voice. So
like the wireless, that is just not that good. I don't know. Oh yeah. All right. So just tell me if there is something that is important missing or something. So, and so yeah. So now when we have that, then we can just state like a very simple control problem. For instance, we can say, okay, how can I just act like on the transcription level? Sorry, at the transcription level. And we want to control, for instance, like the protein quantity. So like, for instance, the concentration, or even like the number of molecules. So that's typically a control problem that is already existing in biology, because I mean, proteins are regulated inside our bodies, for instance. So that's very specific, it's very, like we say, a realistic control problem. All right, so now we need first to be able to represent like biological systems. So in our case, what we use is like a framework called like a reaction network theory. So it's basically, a reaction network is basically like a set of species, okay? So that I call X is related to the state of the system. And then we define like a set of reactions that involve, I mean, those species. And those reactions are going to encode the dynamics of your process. So if you take like the gene expression model, for instance, you have like the gene, or the species are going to be the gene, or the DNA is the same, the messenger RNA and the protein, and we have 4 reactions. So we have two reactions for fusion translation, and we have 2 other ones that are called the degradation or dilution reaction. So I'm going to go like explain that a little bit. So for instance, the first one, the transcription, say you take the gene and you turn that into a gene and mRNA. So basically what it says is that you create like 1 molecule of mRNA. So the gene is like a reaction in like a balance equations in chemistry. It's the same thing. And then the rate of the reaction, which is like the symbol on the top of the arrow, is describing, it's a parameter that describes like the strength of the reaction. So if this parameter is high, then it's a strong reaction, or it's a quick, fast reaction. And if it's like low, it's a slow reaction. And we have 2 other reactions that are called like degradation and dilation, so that are not in the diagram before, that are here because mRNA is not a stable molecule, for instance. It degrades, like the half-life of mRNA is like 10 minutes. So that's actually the reason why, I mean, like the vaccine for COVID-19, which is mRNA based, needs to be like transported like in cold temperature. Otherwise, I mean, it degrades. So that's one of the main reasons why they have to be like contained and transported in very careful conditions. Proteins are like longer lived, but they degrade as well. Or sometimes when the cell divides, for instance, then the new protein is just distributed into the 2 daughter cells. So you have like this basically as kind of degradation. So that's a very simple system. So and it's very general framework because you can just do like whatever you want with that. It's basically a population model. So you can do epidemiology with that. You can do like ecology, population dynamics, networks, multi-agent systems also. So it's pretty broad. So now when we get that, then we have to turn that, this is just a way of representing, basically it's a graph. And so now you need to turn that into a mathematical model. So, but before that, I'm going to just describe a bit what is noise in biology and why it's important. So first of all, I mean, what I want to say is that what we call noise in biology is randomness in mathematics. So it's something that's been coined by Michael Ilowitz in 2002. And so basically, when I say noise, in this case, don't think about like white noise or this kind of thing, just think about something which is random or stochastic or probabilistic. So noise is basically, it's like interesting to living organisms. So you can see that, I mean, noise is like it plays a very important role at many different levels. So for instance, at the evolution level where mutations are random. So we have like some randomness at the phenotypes level. So basically how the way people are look alike. For instance, I mean, you can have two twins with exactly the same DNA, but they may still look different. So, and this is due because some random decisions that are made during development, for instance. And so the molecular counts within a single cell, I mean, can be low, especially for RNAs. And this gives you what we call to intrinsic noise, which is basically the reaction that I described before are not going to be like deterministic. They are going to happen like in a probabilistic way. So they are going to fire at random times. Okay. And then what we call extrinsic noise, I'm not going to focus on that, is that because cells that are similar at the same type, they can behave in a very different way. So it's basically that you have like cell-to-cell variability, but also you have variability inside the cell. So you have like different layers of randomness that are involved in there. So here I'm going to exclusively focus on the intrinsic noise because the rest would overcomplicate like the explanations. It's going to be way more complicated to explain, and the added value is not going to be that interesting. So let's just focus on that. So what is interesting is that noise can be beneficial. It's not, I mean, sometimes we think about randomness of something which is penalizing or that is going to be detrimental to certain functions. That's not true. I mean, in biology, I mean, it has been shown a couple of times that actually noise can be, I mean, cells have been evolving to exploit this randomness to achieve certain functions. For instance, on the left side, it's just like a circadian clock model. So it's like when you see on the trace, it's basically 3 types of proteins that are oscillating with a 24 hours period. So that's actually a model for the circadian clock, which is just the clock that we have in our body. I mean, inside all the cells actually that are just counting the time. That basically is just a timer that says, I mean, what time is it actually? So when you're jet lagged, basically that's what happens is that your like internal clocks, the circadian clock is desynchronized with like the day-night cycle. So you need to have this clock to resynchronize. So that's one thing. And what is important is that this is just a closed system and it's just the noise that makes it oscillating. Okay, and it's also a robust oscillations. If you change the parameters, you still get your oscillations. On the right side is the bistable switch. So it's also an autonomous system with no input. And you see like on the top is like one type of molecule and on the bottom like another type, and they are switching on and off. You know, so one time, I mean, when the blue is active and when the blue is active, the red is inactive, and vice versa. And this can also oscillate because of noise. And if you remove the noise, then this doesn't work anymore. So now, I mean, the question would be that actually would be like if there is an influence of noise on the regulation problem, and if it's possible to basically exploit it, or this is something we're going to fight against. So right now, what I'm going to just clarify a few things and few terminology. So basically, I mean, I'm going to take this definition of the regulation problem that I'm going to use. Of course, I mean, you have variation around that, and so, but this is the one I'm going to use. So when talking about regulation, is this one. So basically, what we want to do is that we just want to find a controller, so that I mean, you can keep the output of your system to like a predefined set point, and this. Despite of the presence of constant disturbances. So that's probably one of the simplest control problem you can consider. And we know that integral control can solve this problem, you know, because using the internal crucible principle. So if you have this problem and say you have a system that is linear, you know that you can use a PI controller to solve that problem most of the time. And of course, there are limitations, but I'm not going to enter into details, but that's roughly the idea. Now, I mean, just in biology, we have something similar. I mean, homeostasis is just the ability of living organisms to regulate their internal states. Okay, so that's basically a flexible regulation. Okay, And then more specifically, we talk about perfect adaptation, which is like the property that molecular levels were written back to the pre-stimuli value after the absence of a particular stimulus. So what happens here is that we have like some system that you can control, the molecular levels, for instance, and if you have some disturbance, then it still goes back to initial level. So that's what we call the regulation problem. So I'm going to, basically when I'm going to talk about perfect adaptation, is going to be regulation. I'm going to use them interchangeably then. So I wanted to clarify that. So regulation motifs are already, we know that they exist because I mean, most of the genetic material that we have actually in our body, I mean, it's mostly regulation. Okay, so we have feedback loops everywhere in our body, inside the cells, but also I would say at a physiological level. For instance, like the hormonal system is a regulation system. And we have been shown that, by we said like researchers in general, that some of them relate to integral control, not all of them, okay? And the main issue there is that there is no, basically, the approach that biologists used to take is they just start with the system and they show that they have this perfect adaptation property, and then but they don't really know, and they will say, okay, this network achieves perfect adaptation, for instance, or exhibits perfect adaptation. But they don't really try to understand what part of the network is governing that, or what part is responsible for this property, right? Well, in control, what we have is that it's more like a more dichotomic point of view, where you have a system that you want to control, and you design your controller so that, I mean, all the specifications are achieved. So basically, you just really see that you have a system and a controller, and if you mix them together, you see, I mean, what does what, right? But in biology, it's like these concepts are more diffused because things also have evolved. I mean, it's like an evolving system, so it's not very clear how to decompose systems into subsystems in biology. Right now, so I'm going to talk two control strategies because I think it's interesting. So the first one is in silico control. I really don't like this name, but I mean, people are calling it like that, so I think we're stuck with that for now. So now, I mean, we just say in silico because you have like in vivo, in vitro, and in silico. So in silico is just inside the computer. So here you want to control like cells, for instance, or cell population. So say you want to control like the protein concentration inside some cell, for instance. And for that, I mean, you can implement your controller inside the computer. So the good thing is that you have no limitations in terms of computational power and complexity of the controller. So you can apply your favorite like control methods like MPC or whatever, it doesn't really matter. Now, I mean, the problem now is actuation. How do you act on the cell, and how do you measure from it, the different variables? So we have two ways. I mean, we have more ways, but the two main dominant strategies are optogenetics. So you use like you shine light on the cells, and the cells, have been engineered so that they can respond to light. Okay, so like red, far red, you have like green, and different like color channels. Or you have chemical induction. So basically, you just like in the culture, you just put like some different molecules, and the cell will react to that. So, and especially in microfluidics devices. So, and the measurements are made either using flow cytometry. So that's the picture on the left. So basically, you take a sample from the culture, you pass in the system, you shine a laser on it, and the light is going to be scattered in different like color channels, and you measure that. And this is basically what you sense is what we call like fluorescent proteins that are inside the cell. So everything has been engineered here. It's not a natural cell. So you engineer them so that they respond to light or to chemical induction, and you also engineer them so that you have like fluorescent proteins inside them so that you can have measurement otherwise. So, and then with that, actually, you can just like have a snapshot, for instance, of like the fluorescence at that time point. So you get the distribution. Or you can have time-lapse microscopy, so maybe some in the middle. So we have like a camera, you couple that with some segmentation algorithm, and you just like separate the different cells, and then you can just measure the fluorescence directly. So this is going to get the time series data in this case. And this can be used to both single cell and population control. And then we have in vivo control, which is, I think, in my opinion, way more interesting, is when you want to implement the control inside the cell. So then, I mean, it's interesting because then we have tons of limitation. Limitation in terms of constraints, of structural constraints, for instance, because you can only implement your controller in terms of DNA, mRNA proteins, and other molecules. It has to be also amenable to a reaction network, so you need to implement your controller in terms of reactions. It has to be robust to noise, because the noise is there. Also to model uncertainties, because we have most of the time in biology, the models are extremely poor. They are very highly dimensional, they are poorly characterized, they are most of the time non-identifiable. So it's just, it's complicated, it's very complex problem. And then we also need to have a low metabolic load, which is interesting, is because when we're going to implement a control inside the cell, this control is going to use some energy from the cell. And if it's draining too much energy, then the cell can die, or even the cell can evolve to reject your controller. And then basically the cell lineages will evolve so that, I mean, then your controller is going to be inactive, because the cell is always striving to optimize the behavior and to optimize the energy consumption. So if they can get rid of something that is not useful for them, that is using energy, then they are going to get rid of them. So here, actuation and measurements are made using molecular interactions. And so since the controller is already inside the cell, and we can do single cell and population control in this case. So that's on the right side, it's like, well, very schematic, but on the left side, it's more general. So you can implement whatever you want in the cell. You can, you have, like, for instance, classifiers that check like different, like mRNA, messenger RNA types, or microRNAs that are another type of RNA inside cells, and detect whether they are cancerous cells. And if it's the case, then they activate like apoptosis, so it kills the cell. So you can do a lot of things. You can implement a lot of things. So that's pretty broad. So right now I'm going to focus more on the more control problems. So that's what we call like the antithetic integral control. So the setup is the following. So we start with an open loop network. Okay, so that's a reaction network with species X there. So think, for instance, about the protein production. So X can be the gene plus the mRNA and the protein and the 4 reactions. And for ease of notation, I will assume that we can act on the production rate of the first species, and that's why I'm calling it the actuated species. And then we need to have an output to your network. So that's going to be XL, for instance, or Y, and that's going to be the control species. So the goal will be to control like the population of XL, okay? So in some sense. So roughly speaking, now the control problem is like, before we had to find a controller for integral control. Okay? Now what we want to find is to find like another reaction network that can interconnect with this one, so that we have our specification are achieved for the closed loop network. So what we want to find now is like another set of species Z and another set of reactions RC, so that, I mean, by acting on the X1, we can control, like we can act on Y indirectly, so that Y will track the desired set point in a certain sense. Okay, so for instance, that can be like the concentration. So, and one solution to that is actually what we call the antithetic integral controller. So it's like a controller that is made of 4 reactions and 2 molecular species. Okay. So I'm going to explain a bit what they mean. So the first one is the measurement reaction, because you see that we can take Y, okay, and then you produce 1 molecule of Y and molecule of Z2. So Y remains unchanged with the reaction, but you produce 1 molecule of Z2. So Z2 actually will be an image of the population of Y, okay, somehow. In a similar way, Z1, actually, that's why I'm going to, Z2 here can be also called like the sensing species. So Z1, you can see that in the second reaction, we produce 1 molecule of X1 depending on the quantity of Z1. So which means that this is the actuation reaction, okay? Because this is basically your control input here. And so Z1 in this case played the role of like the actuating species. Then we have another reaction, which is basically the input to your controller, which is mu, that is regulated to the set point. Like the phi means that it's created out of nothing. You know, it's like a pure production of the molecule. And then we have to close the loop, because until now there is no loop closed. I mean, no Z1 and Z2 are completely uncorrelated there. But then we had this annihilation reaction that basically Z1 was to bind with each other and just leave the system. Okay. So this is basically closing the loop. And then we have 4 controller parameters, okay? 2 of them are, so we have the sensing gain, for instance, is theta, and the K is just the gain of the controller. Right, so basically it's very easy to just draw a parallel between the standard integral controller. So on the top, what we have is just like a classical system, okay, with one, like a CISO system, for instance, input U and output Y, and we have some disturbance acting on the system. We have the feedback loop, we have the sensing gain, okay, theta. And then we just have an integral controller, so integration of the error times gain K, okay? And then we have this subtraction because we want to have a negative feedback loop. But then in our current setup, we have, instead of having a system, we have a reaction network with some stress, for instance, that act on the system and plays the role of a disturbance. And we have also like an actuation reaction, okay, from Z1 to X1 with the gain K. So I just took the same notation for simplicities, and it's very clear. Then we have like this, like the sensing part, which is like on the bottom of the reaction network. Okay, so you produce Z2 with the right equals theta. So it's pretty much the same thing as in the feedback loop above. We have the input with mu, okay, that acts on Z1. That is exactly the same thing. It acts on this like subtractor in the loop on the top. And we have this annihilation reaction, which actually replaces the plus and the addition part and the addition plus minus part in the first diagram. And actually you can prove mathematically that in certain cases that it's exactly that, you know. So it's basically some kind of nonlinear subtraction mechanism. All right, so that's pretty much the same thing. So the good thing with that is that actually you have a controller that, I mean, you can show that this controller is an integral controller. So you have to do a bit of calculation, but you can show that. And so we have like an integrator for our biological system that can be implemented in terms of a chemical reaction network. And so that is amenable to like a biological implementation inside living cells. So we have like two main theoretical results. Okay. So these are pretty broad. So I mean, a deterministic case. So when we model the system, in this case, as deterministic differential equation, so ODEs. So we need three things that are pretty much, I would say, not very surprising. So first, the set point needs to be achievable, which means that the system at least needs to be able to reach that value, because you can have saturations or something. So some set points might not be reachable. Then the network needs to be at least locally statically stable and locally output controllable, which means that it's basically a standard assumption for integral control in this case. And then we need to choose the rate parameters K and eta so that your system is at least locally exponentially stable. So you have some tuning to do, and then it's fine. And then in this case, I mean, for ODEs, you work at the level of concentrations. So you can see that you can do simulation and see that, I mean, this is actually working. And that works like on a very broad class of biochemical system. And that's not very interesting because it's just not that much different than standard, I would say, integral control for nonlinear systems. So there is, it's nice to do it, but it's just not very novel. So now it's getting a bit more interesting. So in the stochastic case, so in this case, we model the system as a jump Markov process, okay? And then we need to have two conditions. So this actually is a bit more restrictive because the calculations are a bit more complicated. So we haven't finished that yet. So the set point is like, you need to be achievable, and you need to open up the door to be ergodic. So in the sense that it's some stability property for stochastic processes. And then you need to be globally output controllable in this case. So, so those are sufficient conditions. So this is not necessary. So, but right now we have proven that actually when this is holds, and for the class of system we have considered, then it works for all the parameters K and eta. So you see that there is a big difference between the deterministic case and the stochastic case. In the deterministic case, you need to choose like your K and eta parameters carefully so that you have stability for the closed system. In the stochastic case, you don't need that. I mean, it's working for all of them. So that's actually pretty striking, because we know that if you take like a system, like even a linear system, you plug an integrator. If you put the gain of your integrator too high, you will very likely destabilize your system. That's not going to happen in the stochastic setting. And so which means that it's basically our noise-induced property. So this is something that seems to arise from the noise, because the noise is the only difference between the two systems. So in this case, I mean, the tracking is like we work in the stochastic process. You work with the average of the protein copy numbers, and that works also for cell populations and single cells. And this, as I said before, we only proved that for like a very simple class of unimolecular reaction networks, which are analogous to linear systems. Okay. Even though, I mean, it's working for more complex systems, but the analysis is more complicated. And most likely that's going to be a case by case analysis, which is actually not funny. So now if we go back, I will just go through simulation results and some experiments, because that's actually the most interesting part. So in this case, we're just going to talk about we want to control this like protein production system. So we start with the transcription and translation reactions, and you plug, so that's the diagram I had at the beginning of my talk, and you just plug your controller to that. So the blue protein is Z2 is going to be the sensing molecule, and the red one is the actuating, and you act on the system. So you close the system like this. So then, I mean, we get something like this. So I'm not going to go through all all of that, but I'm going to go through like the most important points. So on the top, you have like the model for the deterministic system, okay, where X1 and X2, X1 is just like the concentration of mRNA, and X2 is the concentration of the protein, and Z1, Z2 is just the state of the controller. So that's what the model looks like. And then below you have this, the dynamics of the mean, okay? So it's pretty much the same thing as above. So it's like the mean copy number, except that we have this extra covariance term that are located like in the dynamics of the controller. Okay. So if you're purely deterministic, then this covariance term is 0. The expectations are equal to the actual values, and you get the model above. So you can see that the only difference between these two models are those covariance terms. So on the block just on the right, so we have this is bifurcation diagram. So in the deterministic case, if you choose your gain k and your parameter eta to be below that curve, then you have a stable equilibrium point. Otherwise, if it's above, you have a stable limit cycle. So you're going to an oscillatory behavior. So you can see that if I take the point 10, 10, it is back to some trajectories that are both converging to the desired steady state. You know, the deterministic is in orange, the mean trajectory is in green. So the mean trajectory is just the stochastic case. And if you take above, you can see that the orange trajectory starts oscillating while the green one is converging. So that illustrates the fact that in this case, we don't have any bifurcation as in the deterministic case. So you're still going to converge to the desired steady state value. So the set point in this case. Then actually maybe the one interesting is that the set point tracking on the bottom left. So below, behind it, like it's like in blue-green, is actually 2 traces of the cell. So it's like actually simulating 2 cells. So that's actually an actual cell trajectory, which is very noisy, as you can see. And then if you average that behavior, you get like the red curve, and you can see that I made several steps in the reference, and you just go, you just track it very nicely. And similarly on the right of that box, then you have like basically disturbance rejection. So that seems to work as expected. So that's enough for the theory. Nice to have like to show some experiments. So I'm going to explain what that means. So on the top left, I mean, you have like this open loop system. So on the right bottom, when you have ARSC and FGFP, that's your system. Okay, so you can act on the production of this ARSC molecule, and it's producing like this FGFP, which is the fluorescent protein. Okay, and then the top part, which is like this MFLON, is just a disturbance that's going to destroy these molecules. Okay. So in the open, and then you can just basically just like use like the concentration of like this HSL, which is like acting on the production of this SIGW molecule, to act and just acting as an input to your system. So you can see like on the bar diagram below. So you have like different conditions like of HSL and ARA, which is basically going to tune your set point. Okay, so that's every group is for different set point. And on the red one is without the disturbance. Okay, so you don't have this MFLON. And in the green one, you have this disturbance. So you can see that the fluorescence decreases, which represent that, I mean, you have less molecule of RC in the system. Okay, so your system clearly reacts to not only the set points, but also to the disturbance. And of course, there is no controller, so you cannot reject it. So now if you move to the top right, so we have the closed loop system. So what we have now is that we complete with the feedback loop. So we have RSIW and SIGW. So those are the Z1, Z2 molecular species of the controller, and we can see that they are binding with each other. And basically SIGW is your Z1 and RSIW is your Z2. And you have this like the actuation species, you get the actuation reaction. So from the SIGW right to the system, but then RSC is going to go back to the production of RSIW. So we have basically a closed loop system, okay, plus some module that is going to do creating the disturbance. And then you can do exactly the same experiments as before in the same condition for different set points. And then you can see that again, well, before perturbation, you have like red, okay? So in red, so you have a certain level, and after perturbation, you can see that you stay pretty much at the same level. So of course, it's not exactly the same because like measurements are always due to uncertainties, but roughly speaking, I mean, it does its job. So we can see that we just go back to the desired steady state. So those are actually steady state values. Okay, so basically you just activate the system and you just wait to stabilize, and then you just measure the fluorescence. but it's also working at the time series level. So on the bottom level is the open loop system. So basically you pre-stabilize it around like a desired set point, which is normalized, so 1. And then you input this ATC molecule at some time, whatever, 2. And this ATC molecule, if you go back to the diagram, is the molecule that basically adds some MF1 that is going to be act as a disturbance on your system. And you can see that in the open loop case, I mean, with perturbation, you just go down. So basically, you have less fluorescence, so less molecule. Why? Because the disturbance acts negatively on the system. It destroys the protein. But you see that on the right side, then the controller acts back and then can stabilize back to the desired value. So of course, I mean, you have like variability. It's biology. It's very difficult to control the system, but both qualitatively and quantitatively, these results are actually pretty good. So I've not been involved to do experiments. Absolutely no talent in making experiments, and also it took pretty much like 6 years for them to do that. So I'm not patient enough for doing this kind of thing. So if people are interested, I put like I have like the reference. I can provide the reference at the end of the talk. That's pretty much what I wanted to talk about. So I just wanted to at least just describe a bit all these ideas. So what we want to say by cybergenetics. So it's basically, of course, a portmanteau term between cybernetics and genetics. And the idea of these projects is try to bring ideas from control and biology and develop own like specific control techniques for the control of like living organisms. So with potential applications. So applications could be like for bioreactors for producing like a biofuel, for instance, or antibodies or some other things. Can be also used for treating like certain disease, because some disease, for instance, is just like a feedback loop. There is like a bad mutation on certain gene that is responsible for some regulation, and then the feedback loop is broken. So restoring the loop would in principle cure the disease. So I mean, the idea right now was also to produce like at least a very simple result. So basically, we just took like the simplest control structure that you can get, which is integral control. I mean, it's simple, but it's also extremely useful, and it's like a cornerstone of control, actually. We show that actually you can actually implement that in terms of reaction networks. It can be modular because it's just plug and play. You can just plug it to every system you want. It's generic. So, and it does, I haven't talked about that, but it can be shown to have a very low metabolic load. So you can just tune the parameters in a way, because now we know that you can be stable for all parameters values, so you can use these degrees of freedom to do something else. And for that, you can just decrease, for instance, like the transient, or you can make it faster, for instance, but you can also reduce the metabolic load on the host, actually, on the cell. So it works both in the deterministic and the stochastic setting. That's actually the only controller so far that can do it in both in the deterministic and the stochastic. Some other controllers exist in the deterministic case, but they failed to do actually in the stochastic setting for technical reasons, but they just don't work. Another thing is that actually it works experimentally, which is also very nice, because that's essentially a theoretical work that we transport to experiments, and not that many works that actually did some theory and then they got like proved and validated in experiments. I mean, the number of papers that have been to do that is pretty low, at least in biology. I mean, in physics is different. And of course, I mean, a lot of things remain to be done. There are lots of things in the analysis for the closed loop system, like in mathematical techniques, in numerical techniques for simulation. In control, a lot of things remain to be done, like different classes of controller, different objectives, different types of reaction, of disturbances. So basically everything needs to be done. Right now, I'm working on the MPC and optimal control for the system, but also on the side, I'm working on like the filtering. So how do you do the noise filtering, compensation? What's a Kalman filter for the system, for the observation of hidden variables that work? Do you need to? So there is a lot of things that need to be done also on that. So basically, the whole control theory for this class of systems. And it's also the idea behind this control theory was not simply to apply what we know. The idea was also to have like a more bottom-up approach, with just like you see the problems in biology, and then you have tools and concepts and ideas that should emerge from the problem, and not just applying what you've been taught in school or something to this kind of problems. So you need to rethink a lot of things, and so that's actually why I find this problem interesting. All right, so that's pretty much like everything I wanted to talk about today. So, and I'm be happy to answer some questions. The references. I can provide you more. I mean, it's just a lot of things. right? So stop sharing. So the chat. All right. All right, so what is the role of latency in this system? You're saying that like noise, delay can also be manifested in biological system. Have you investigated issues? Okay, so I mean, so the thing that, yeah, so I mean, of course, you have delays. That's actually, so it's another problem that we have. So we have like delays that are either due to two things. They are either due because you have multiple stages. So that's most likely going to be more like a distributed delay. But also we have delays that are emerging from the fact that we make like drastic simplifications of the biology. And so you might need to basically add delays. So I have worked on delays and stochastic delays actually, where actually delays are going to be time varying and drawn from some distribution. And surprisingly, in this case, many stability properties, I mean, delays are not that harmful in this case, not as like I would say, like other types of systems where most of the time delays are associated with reduction of performance or instability if the delays are maybe too large. In this case, I mean, they don't have like very dramatic impact. Of course, it can slow down a bit like the response, but the stability properties are going to be preserved. And in particular, for the integral control I'm talking about, if you add delays on the sensing channel and the input channel, so input and output delays, those delays are not going to destabilize your closed loop system. So we're going to be robust with respect to those delays as well. And so provided that the delays are taken from that type, like this classes of distributions that are called like phase step distributions that are actually emerging from queuing theory. And but those are actually very broad. So they cover a lot of like classes of distributions. So yeah, so I hope this answered the question. Otherwise, we can also have like an offline, I mean, not too offline, but also a discussion on Discord. I mean, very often there. All right, thanks a lot for the greetings, everyone. Okay, so why do experiments take so long? And is that because of the process itself being very slow? Okay, so problem is that actually biology is not a predictive field. It's very difficult to predict the outcome. Why? Because we don't know. I mean, we don't really know biology. We know a few things about biology, but I mean, the cell is already like a simple bacteria. It's a very complex process already. Okay, and you have a lot of like, and things are working in a way that actually is not like some intelligent design or something. It's a mess because things have been evolving, and you cannot just like split like the genome of like a simple cell and say, okay, that stuff is for doing that, that stuff is for doing that. So there is no real compartments. So everything works as a whole. That's why I mean, like the reductionist approach, when you basically the reductionist approach is that you take the system as a whole and you fragment it in sub parts, you know, and you can analyze all the sub parts independently of the other and then plug them back. That doesn't work because everything works as a whole. So you need to have a holistic approach in this case, which means you need to consider everything. And so that the problem here is that when you analyze something small, like for instance, the network I showed, you know, I mean, you have a lot of coupling with the cell, you know, because you have a lot of resources that are used by the controller, the cell, and the controller and the system you want to control that are shared with the cell. Okay, and if it's shared with the cell, then it's going to be shared with all the other network in the cell. So you have a massive coupling inside like your cell. So which means that even some small weird behavior of like something inside the cell can perturb the system. So that explains, I mean, part of explain why it's difficult to predict things. If you would know everything by heart, you know, like well, you know like very well, and you have a very powerful simulator, that wouldn't happen. Then that's actually a main problem for that. Then experiments also is that things are not, I mean, it doesn't really make sense. Because for instance, you can have, for instance, the controller that you take there and it's working well in this bacteria. And you can just change bacteria and then it's just not gonna work. Why? Yeah, no one really knows. So it's just, biology is just not a predictive field, what you do in simulation. That's why, I mean, I was also mentioning the fact that it's working in practice. It's actually that the likelihood that it was the case was very low. That's actually, so that's actually, I mean, it's mostly luck. And, yeah, so, and then it's not necessarily gathering data. It's just making sure that things are working and trying to understand, because also you need to have a lot of controls to make sure that what you observe is actually the action of the controller, for instance, and not like some artifact that something else is doing something, but your controller is not working. Okay, so you need to have a lot of debugging, and I mean, I remember like when they started doing that. I mean, they had like long meetings, and sometimes they just realized that, I mean, the controller was not working. It was like some other mechanism in the cell that was doing that, and combined with some other mechanisms, it was kind of regulating, but it was just like something balancing each other for almost no reason. So when actually we will be able to have like a better understanding of the biology, that we will have like reliable simulator, then hopefully we'll make the job like simpler for those people, because it's just, I mean, I don't understand how they can enjoy doing that, because I mean, it's like, I mean, they made like maybe 700 experiments. I mean, 700 times they repeated that experiment. I mean, I think you imagine that. And I mean, I would have given up like almost immediately, personally. And yeah, so yeah, that's actually the main reason is like we don't understand the biology. And when we implement things, and the problem when we implement this controller inside the biology, we implement something that we don't even know very well. You know, it's like, I mean, I don't know if you have a good analogy, but because I mean, it's just, I don't know, it's just basically implementing some software in some like very like high performance software, like in some hardware that actually don't even know how it's working, you know. So of course it's gonna fail, you know, or you use like the wrong programming language or something like this. So yeah, I hope that explained, that answered the questions. Yeah, well, I guess it's that's it for now. No, of course, I'm on the Discord, so you feel free to send me messages if you want some references. Also, I can provide you with some good readings. There are some nice books. Some books are starting to come out on these problems. They are pretty recent. But it's mostly the most interesting part here is only at the research level, and especially in papers. Right. So I think.
Yep. Well, I guess we're pretty ahead of schedule. So the next person will be merrily or harshly doomed, depending on what time of year it is.
Okay, fine. So I'll be presenting on control and monitoring of intelligent electric power grids. The buzzword here is basically smart grids. Like one of the few things which you will see talking about in power industry, which is an active field of research. So my entire goal here right now is to explain what is the current control implementation in your power systems. Then we will see why do we need more newer controls, and why is there such a strong demand, and why is it the only field of power which is actually well known outside the power engineering department. We'll be talking about the controls for new controls for generation and state estimation monitoring using PMUs. We'll be discussing that. Transmission and distribution control. Then we'll discuss what are the graphs, conclusions, and all. We'll be keeping this more algorithmic, keep it a little light. There's lots of interesting stuff to talk about. So firstly, this is the generator model. We'll be talking about in generation stations in the traditional power systems, you didn't have renewable energy resources to concern. We mostly had thermal energy power plants, which ran on coal. You feed in hot gas, and then it will turn on the turbine. So this is a model block diagram representation of this. So this is this blue box is your turbine, which is connected to the synchronous generator. These two blocks are your controllers for your synchronous generator. So just to make sure that your synchronous generator doesn't go all bonkers if something fails in your generation station itself. You don't want, your first step should be to make sure at least the power gets transmitted out of the generation station. You should not stay there, get wasted, things like that. So the first one is your AVR, which stands for automatic voltage regulator. It basically controls your field current of your motor which is connected to it. The other one is your speed governor, which basically controls your the speed at which the rotor is moving around, so that just to make sure that there's no back EMF problems and all that. This is an example of your entire transmission and distribution system represented as a single line diagram. I mentioned this single line diagram in reading material. You can take a look into it. Basically, it's a sort of like system identification thing which power engineers do to like model the entire power grid. For example, this power grid is a 44 bus system. Basically, that means there are 44 different nodes where different substations might be present and all that. For example, this can be used to like represent the entire transmission and distribution system of New England, for example. The above here represents like what is the base power of this particular power system, and then you have your frequency of this particular power grid, which if it's not visible, it's around 60 hertz, I suppose. But we can't conduct analysis each and every time on this 44 bus system. There are like 119 bus systems. Like you will have like 119 differential equations to solve, which depending on case, which might even be partial differential equations. Computers can't solve that much amount of things like in such a short time. So instead, what researchers typically do here is to like scale this particular power system down, make it for like a small area. For example, 9-bus system is a very typical popular example which is used to compare analysis and benchmark different analysis techniques, which we'll be seeing later. So this is your like 9-bus system, which I spend most of my work on a small mini project here. These black boxes are your impedances of your transmission lines. These are your loads. These are represented as generators. These are buses. These small blocks are your transformers, which can be 3-phase transformers depending on it. But usually we keep everything in a single phase, which we call it as per phase equivalence. I have mentioned it already in the reading material. You can take a look into it. So this is the main controls part which was there in your conventional power systems. We usually keep, usually for most power systems, there weren't like too heavy loads to drive. Like at most of the times, you just had resistances and not too much motors, except for like few industrial machines and all, which they most typically use either the synchronous machines or your DC motors. So this is basically driven by your PI controller. Here are some signal processing blocks which will take your grid frequency. The grid frequency is probably one of the most important parameters in your power system, because if your grid frequency is not equal to the nominal grid frequency, that means your transformers are at risk, because your transformers are not rated for like certain frequencies. When it's like when it goes up or down, your transmission lines might cause some issues. There are like various other factors. P1, P2 are your power lines, which are just getting like processed through a signal processing blocks. This is like a reference signal which you send to like make sure like it's at the same specific volt power levels. This is the output. So this is the entire block diagram represented here with lots of abstractions put in together. So we do need to measure like states of your power systems just to make sure like how are we able to get this thing inside. Usually that was done previously by SCADA systems. I think it's still done by SCADA systems now, but there are other more faster systems to do so. This particular thing was implemented using power flow analysis methods. The power flow studies is probably one of the most interesting parts, I would say, of power engineering. The most common and the most fastest way of doing this in industry is using something known as DC power flow analysis, which will basically take only your active power into consideration, which is your real part of your power. We don't consider reactive parts. So we will this we consider this because it gives us like unique solution, reliability, as we see in the slide. The main issues here are like make sure like error detection paths are to make sure error detection and do error correction if in case like if your sensors are tampered in, for instance, and your power flow matrix is throwing up some weird answers. So this is a typical power flow DC power flow calculation, which I did it in MATLAB for my mini project. So this is the DC power flow error detection paths, which I this DC power flow thing. Well, DC power flow error detection was implemented using sparse decomposition, which is by varying the different sparsity values of the matrix. For example, in scenario 1, we have sparsity value of 0.03. So we are seeing what is the detected error using this particular algorithm, and then like what if we add another what if there is an additional sparsity error. For the second example is like for different sparsity value. The third example is for like different sparsity value. For example, for this one, it's sparsity value of 0.15. So these are some like typical results which you might see from such sort of analysis. Here time is measured in seconds. Here we are measuring the bus voltages at node 4 of a 9-bus system. As we see, like this is basically a unit step response of this particular system when we switch on like a particular load at a particular point. So we see it stabilizes after a particular point, but so it is able to manage considerably well. However, like when you consider grid frequency values, you can't have such a long amount of time just for a simple unit step response. Like sometimes you just have like varying responses which might actually convolute this entire response sheet. So we need some solutions. So for motivation, why do we need more controls? We can do remote management because we don't want people sitting in manual substations monitoring each and everything and like take manual control actions, which takes such a long amount of time. It's not worth it. You can implement better controls at generation side for distributed generation, which is basically sort of mixing of like renewable energy sources along with your conventional thermal energy power plant, so that we can get like more economic eco-friendly solution towards generation. Offload processing power via computer networks. We can implement more control techniques at the transmission side. Interoperability is one of the few buzzwords going around in smart grid systems. So as to make sure like we can use a standard protocol so that we can able to connect every grid using a single communication network. So now we'll be going towards like more newer control models towards these particular problems. So that in generation side, we'll have this is an example of a MRAC control implemented for wind generator. We see here we are feeding in some reference values, which is if yeah. So we are feeding in some reference values here. So it will take your transfer functions and also to monitor your wind, the rate at which your wind generator is actually able to generate power, so as to make sure not to destabilize the as it goes along the transmission side because of frequency changes and all. Because wind generator, like wind can be modeled as your kind of a stochastic problem using typical Weibull distribution, for example. So at times when it doesn't match your particular thing, so it might cause some frequency errors and all. Here is an example of implementing maximum power point transfer based PID control for PV generator modules. We see, and I implemented it using PS algorithm because probably it's one of my favorites to use. So we'll be taking a side step towards monitoring system design and talk about the reason why power engineers usually can use this power monitoring system design to make more data based control actions rather than just model based ones. So there are various ways which you can do this. The common way is the way which I did it was using constrained application protocol with FRIT protocol, which is very common in, I would say, past decade or something for smart grids for SCADA as well as PMUs, which are known as phasor measurement units, which are like sensing and like control devices for typical industrial applications. Here we see the interconnection between communication lines as well as energy lines, essentially linking them together to make more informed decisions. So phasors, since I was more of a Star Trek fan, I typically relate them to Star Trek. So for the memes, I suppose. But to return to a more serious part, like this is what your phasor measurement units look like. A phasor measurement unit is basically device which takes and measures the voltage phasors along with certain power readings with time stampings. This time stampings is essential because as this gets passed along to your servers, which like M2M core servers, which I'm here, M2M stands for machine to machine communications. Your servers are basically device places which you'll connect, which will collect your phasor measurement data so as to arrange them in like proper time sequences based on a time stamping which you have done. This is also based on which typically does time synchronization so as to make sure like your data is continuous and like it's not mismatched due to communication delays, for example. These servers are typically called as phasor data concentrators, which, for example, these are called phasor data concentrators, which are distributed along for like each region, and then all these regions are connected into like one super server, which is called as super PDCs of super phasor data concentrators, and then it's passed along to digital substations, for instance. So yeah, this slide basically says like what I've said so far, like design it using constrained application protocol with IEC 61850. And one advantage of phasor measurement units, as if you study or if you encounter implementation or instrumentation of measuring devices, you will typically see that your SCADA based systems are typically much slower, which have a sampling time of like 3 to 4 samples per minute or 2 minutes or something. Your PMUs can measure data for like around like 5 to 50 to 300 times per second, which is like considerable improvement. So this is your interfacing between constrained application protocol, which is based on REST architecture. You can study that. I have linked the references for controls within this particular protocol to make sure the interfacing is done properly, because this can take quite a lot of time to explain and it's based on more advanced computer science stuff. So on to the more interesting parts. This is a basic logic, I would say, for implementing transmission distribution control, which I use. The other systems also exist. For example, there are adaptive control schemes which use MRAC controller instead of like MPC based SPS controller, for instance. Or I have linked a resource at the end of the presentation which talks about chaos properties and bifurcations of power systems if your sensor properties are mismatched due to cyber attacks or something, because we are of course using protocols here to do our monitoring purposes. So there are some chances like your power system, there's a good chance your power system can get hacked by Russian hackers, for instance. So typical logic is to take your PMU measurements and put it into a state estimator, and then you pass it along to a power flow analysis, which can then you pass it along to like a dynamics security program just to make sure the data which is being analyzed is actually a good data and not bad data. If it's not a good data, for example, you can send them to your MPC based controls, for example, to take the necessary control actions. So if there's some control action to be taken via a state estimator, it can get passed along to your MPC, which can pass a control signal to your power grid, which can take appropriate actions to monitor the frequency as well as voltage levels of your power system. So one particular problem with your state estimate power flow analysis method, which I described before, that is your DC power flow, is that it only takes account of your real power just to make sure that your analysis is actually done faster. The other thing is that DC power flow analysis does not account for stochastic approaches or optimizing the maximum power delivery to the consumers, because the entire goal of making a power system stable and efficient is to make sure that your consumers don't even notice that there is no such kind of like power interruption or blackouts for some reason. So to ensure that the state of the art measure for right now is using something known as DSOPF, which stands for Dynamic Stochastic Optimal Power Flow. It is a dynamic programming method plus your typical power flow analysis done for power systems, which uses something known as an adaptive critic network. It's similar to what you have done in, let's say, machine learning, for instance, but a little bit more different because it sort of goes for like criticizing your errors just to make sure that your error signal which you've got is proper or not, make sure your stochastics are done right. For this particular algorithm, for instance, is done via something called dual heuristic dynamic programming. You can take a look into it. I've linked a resource. This takes in your gradients and passes along to if it's fine or not. If it's not fine, you can pass along to the output of the plan, and then like it can go to next iteration. So this is like a hybrid approach which combines both model driven as well as data driven, which is like a typical need of the hour for power systems. So for cybersecurity analysis, for example, we typically divide the power system into like specific areas. For example, here I have divided this 9-bus network into three separate regions. So this takes in, and each of these regions have like a PMU attached to it just to make sure your you can actually observe the system. So I have made some cyber attack models as well, which is a typical property of doing system identification process. You can there's actually a good active research going along for modeling cyber attacks, so that we can just feed it into our power system directly instead of like going towards like more model data driven approaches. But data driven approaches are typically more common, like if you're, for instance, to go for approaching it via mixed integer linear program or big M methods, for instance. This particular model is an example of false data injection attack, which can be done on your PMF, for instance. So that like for example, like if you want to take advantage of some particular political party ensuring continuous power supplies, for instance, you can just do a false data injection attack just to make sure that consumers are getting like more the power than what they actually use. Hence, the power cost for them is more. But please don't try this. This is mainly for analysis purposes only. So the state estimation method which I use here for my analysis was using uncentered Kalman filters, which takes in your transition as well as state estimation Jacobian functions and feeds in your PMU and SCADA measurements. And if your state estimator is triggered, it will go on to weighted second. It will trigger your state estimation using the WLS approach, which is basically weighted least square estimation. Then based on the predicted states, it will detect whether it's a false data injection attack or not. If it's a false data injection attack, it will go towards the control room, it will send an alarm, and then it will go to the next time and trigger it. If it's not a false data injection attack, it will go to the next iteration and then execute the same algorithm again. However, this is just attack detection. To actually treat the attack, I personally went for false fuzzy neural network approaches. So I defined like two membership functions here. The first membership functions is actually going to take into account the frequency of the communication between the attack detection nodes. The attack detection nodes, for instance, are these PMUs, which are your sensing devices in this case of false data injection attacks. So this is membership function is based on Werner model, which is actually another recent dynamic model based on recent researchers. I think it's around 2018 or 2019 paper. I've linked it into references again. The other membership function which I used here was to do attack detection rate. So the rate at which your attack is detected. So just to make sure that there is sufficient gap between like different attacks, just to make sure a cyber attack doesn't go unnoticed. But this is the best we can do for right now. So this is a MATLAB model which I implemented to do fuzzy neural network based fuzzy neural control, which while I did the first few things using Modelica, this Modelica tool allows us to like create functional markup interfaces to do co-simulation, which takes the best out of all the simulators to make sure that your simulation is actually done accurately, though it comes at a cost for speed at which the simulation is executed, which at times can take weeks. So let's look at some results right now. So this is the wind generation response of at the generation station of using your MRAC controller. As we see, like just before it even hits 50 milliseconds, the controller started to stabilize, and like, which is actually a great response. Like if you use your PID, for instance, here, it won't be able to like, it may not be able to stabilize the wind generator model, wind generation in your generation station at times, like if your disturbance is too huge due to stochastic errors and all. These graphs are for basic transmission systems when we implement MPC control, and when we don't implement MPC control. These are your voltage phasors at bus 5, 7, 8 in your 9-bus system, which I was talking about. These, as we see, these are really good results, like compared to what we saw in using PI controllers, that which took around 50 milliseconds to actually stabilize. This is actually really good, like 10 milliseconds and it starts to stabilize. Like it's really rare to see such good responses in power systems actually. Now, if you wanted to go completely crazy with it, with like I did for this particular control behavior, I simulated this for 44 bus system, which I called it like a New England system, which I referenced it from another reference paper for like some set of buses here. Like it scales up really well, as we see. Sure, it takes like a long time to simulate, but it's able to stabilize like around 20 milliseconds and like actually go down to zero. Like it's really good. And by the way, these voltage magnitudes are measured in per units, which you can find in reference reading material again. And these are the responses of like when you subject your, as we were discussing, this power grid model is divided into like 3 areas. So this talks about the frequency response when it's subjected to false data injection attack at like the PME block, or when it's subjected to your control block like your AGC, for example, which is automatic generation control. As we see, this is actually really good results. Like if your attack begins here, it goes down, and like within a few instants back up again at it's relatively stable. And this is the output of the fuzzy neural network implementation using piezo optimizer, which basically is to make sure that your neural network implementation actually works. Now you can go even beyond and talk about electric vehicles, smart grid interconnections using Lie theory and various other things, which actually went beyond me. This was just an additional thing. So at the end, like you can talk about future scopes, like implementing more robust controls, because robustness is what's important, other than like your basic optimization in your power systems. So like implementing like more robust control for cyber attacks can be beneficial here. Going for hierarchical control for EV smart grids interconnects to like, because you can even use your electric vehicles to like charge the power grid, for instance, just to make sure that your power grid is stable. Then you can talk about like implementing non-linear optimal controllers for grid control, because your smart grid is actually non-linear in nature. You have non-linear differential equations to deal with, and optimal controllers are usually like MPC are usually for linear systems. I just made approximations here, but we see like it still works for just by using approximating it, but non-linear can probably make it more optimal, say the least. So in conclusion, we have just described like how can we use Modelica to as a simulation environment, and we can do future work on optimization and better control strategies. So this concludes presentation. You can take a look into references. I linked up presentation slides if you want. So if you have any queries, I'll be open to it. Okay, I see question from Falcon here. In case of a wind turbine, how does the grid demand generator actual control loop generally work? Where is the control? Target value is given. Generator. Yes, in case of the wind turbine, the control is actually done locally because we want to make sure this control action is taken much faster than just via the MPC than from just from the transmission and distribution side of it, because like your MPC control is basically based on your transmission and distribution networks, which can actually take a few minutes to a couple of hours to take place. Whereas in generation station, you want to make sure that your control is actually taken much faster, like within terms of seconds, ideally. So it's done locally, and the local control system is supposed to meet that particular number. Sways asks whether force attack will be a massive unexpected spike in pass somewhere in the grid. How would you deciphering it as an action malfunction? Well, we can't actually. So for that, we can just have to make sure that whatever the grid operator is actually responsible for, like to decipher whether it's an actual attack or like it's based on like severe malfunction of the grid. If it's a severe malfunction of the grid, like they still have to take control of it. Like if it's not a severe malfunction, probably it might be a cyber attacks. Who knows? In most cases, like if it's a malfunction, your MPC controller should be able to take care of it. So any more queries, I suppose? I don't think so. So if you have any more questions, you can ask me on Discord. And this is actually completely new to me. And like I am not yet fully that thorough with power systems, power electron, like in general power analysis in general. So I'd be happy to like know like if you have any other inputs which I can learn from as well. So thank you.
So that was our last talk for today. I hope everyone enjoyed the topics that were presented. We only had 2 technical issues, and one of those was user error, so we must be in the top 1% of conferences, so that's pretty good. I have some notes on future improvements. I want to reduce the number of everyone pings that go out in order to get people notified of stuff. I want to make a specific group so the people who are really interested in it will get pinged all the time, and people won't get pinged as often if they're not specifically interested in it. But I will be posting a survey in the announcements channel so we can get feedback on how it went and improvements for the future. And if you're interested in participating in the future, I have a sign-up form which I'll link again in the announcements channel, which helps us gauge when we could have another set of talks, and then try to get preliminary schedules. We had some more advanced topics and medium to long presentations this time, but we also have the possibility of having shorter talks for just sharing an idea and getting feedback, or pretty much whatever someone's interested in talking about and having people get eyes on an idea. Yeah, I can take a couple questions now if people have any questions about future plans, but I have something else to get to in a little bit. Or I can just run away. Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you to the speakers for jumping into something new and scary. I'm pretty happy with the amount of interest we got, so this will definitely be something to look into doing again. Pretty much I'm thinking of, well, depending on the amount of interest, which just if people have ideas for stuff to talk about, we could potentially do this once a month if there was enough interest. I think probably the length of 2 hours is probably pretty fitting for for the attention spans of people on the internet. So then we could also mess around with time zones a bit so that people who are on the other side of the world can also be able to present live and show up and listen, so we can alternate setups a little bit. But of course, it's entirely based on speaker availability. So we need people. Anything else? Well, if you have any other comments or anything, I'll have the survey up soon. And then, or you can ping me directly in the conference talk channel or similar. But thank you everyone for participating, and have a nice day or night, wherever you are.